So this is going to be our really brief introduction to taste and smell. We're going to do a lot more in class in terms of activities and a couple cool videos that kind of elaborate further on this, but let's jump into it and clean up that packet. So first things, you're going to take a second, you want to take a second here and label this picture on the left. You'll probably want to pause it. The number one is down here. These are the receptor hairs. Okay. Number two is the olfactory nerve fibers. And number three is the olfactory bulb. So take a second and make sure you label those up in your picture. Alright, so now that you've got those labeled, let's take a look at the picture and make sure we see what's going on here. Okay. So what we've got here, we've got the nose over on this side, and we've got the mouth kind of right here. Okay. So what this is showing is odor molecules coming in here. Okay. So here's our big overview, and then we'll kind of jump into it. The big overview is that when molecules come in here, they've got to then be dissolved in this mucus. So inside here, remember you got all this mucus inside your nose? It's got to dissolve those molecules, okay? Yeah. Once they're dissolved, they're going to bind to the bottom here to these receptor hairs. And these receptor hairs, essentially they're just chemically gated channels. So they're very specific. They bind to certain molecules. When they reach threshold, they will then send signals up through the nerve fibers, through the bone here, and this is called the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. So it's this really thin section of bone here, but there's little holes in here. You'll see them in the lab tomorrow. Okay, passes on up to the olfactory bulb, and the olfactory bulb does some processing. It kind of combines information before sending it on. And the way it kind of looks is kind of like this. So imagine, I'm going to zoom in on this olfactory bulb for 1 second. So here, imagine here's the nerve, and here's this big olfactory bulb. And what it does, it combines information. So imagine that here and here and here were all three receptor hairs for the same molecule. So say what makes oranges smell like oranges, okay? So instead of sending three separate signals to the brain like this, what we do is we combine them inside the olfactory bulb, and we can then just send one action potential to the brain. And obviously, the more signals in here, the higher the frequency the signal will be from this. And so you know it's stronger smell of orange. We add in some more receptors and add in some more receptors. We get a higher frequency of action potentials, and you get a much stronger signal going to the brain. But that's the basic idea, guys. It's that simple, okay? You've got gated receptors. They pass on here, do a little processing in the bulb, and then boom, onto the brain. On the right-hand side, we have just a zoomed-in picture of exactly that, guys. So here's that cribriform plate. Here are the receptor hairs down here that do all the binding. Here are those fibers that kind of come up and through, and up here would be the, as you see here, to the olfactory bulb. So this is just a zoomed-in picture of this little chunk right here. All right? So in terms of what those structures actually do, we kind of ran through it already, but we'll make sure you see it here. So the first one, the receptor hairs can actually be stimulated by specific molecules to reach threshold. So that's where they're excitable. They can actually send signals to the brain about what we're smelling. Okay. The second one on here, they just carry the action potentials to the olfactory bulb, the nerve fibers. Okay. And then in the olfactory bulb, as we mentioned, we do some processing of action potentials before passing the info to the brain. All right. And then down below is just the fill-in section showing exactly what I just explained to you. You'll probably have to pause it and get it all down. But let me run through it, guys, and then pause it afterwards, okay? So very first thing is you got the molecules, okay? So the molecules have to come in, and they have to be dissolved. That's really important. So the molecules have to be dissolved, okay? And the mucus is what's going to do all the dissolving here, okay? After they bind to the chemically gated channels, right, they're specific chemicals, so they're chemically gated channels. Once they bind to the chemically gated channels, on the tips of the receptor hairs, the doors open, they depolarize, right, because we're moving towards threshold, so they move towards threshold. Once they hit threshold, they send an impulse, right, so we get our impulse onto the olfactory bulb, okay, and the olfactory bulb does a little bit of processing, and then sends the signal on the olfactory nerve directly to the cerebrum. Remember, this is the only one that goes directly to the cerebrum. All the other cranial nerves, you remember, went into the brainstem and up to the thalamus and then got sent to where they wanted to go, okay? But this one goes directly to the cerebrum, okay? And then we go on to the olfactory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe, okay? So why don't you pause that and fill those in real quick. All right, so as we get back into this, a couple of random pieces, guys. So we have lots of different stimuli, and it varies. You'll see a video tomorrow that talks about a bunch of different things. But we can distinguish between thousands of different chemical stimuli, and then if you add them up into combinations, it kind of becomes limitless combinations. So it's pretty impressive. Okay, the receptor population actually has turnover. So these are actually neurons that die off, and we actually rebuild them. There are some neurons that do that. Taste does that a little bit, but smell is our biggest one in terms of the number of cells that kind of die off and keep rebuilding. All right, so let's move on to taste. So gustation is our sense of taste. Okay, it's a big fancy word for it, but gustatory, you remember that from last unit. What could we taste? We can taste these 5 things: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Okay, and if you think about them, they kind of make sense. So sweet is sugary, right? So sweet would be kind of sugary. So evolutionarily, being able to determine what was sugary was good for us because we want carbs for ATP, for cell respiration. Okay. The sour, generally we find sour kind of off-putting, and that makes sense because most things that have spoiled have a sour flavor. Okay. Salty, salt is really important. Remember electrolytes. Our nerves and muscles can't function well at the right level. So a little bit of salt in food we like. Too much salt in food actually turns us off because too much salt is actually bad for the body. So that makes sense evolutionarily. Okay. Bitter, we typically do not care for bitter naturally. If that's things like coffee is a pretty good example of something's bitter, and that's kind of an acquired taste. Children don't start liking coffee. That's kind of you grow to like it. And most people associate bitter with most things that are poisonous in nature, so that kind of makes sense for us. And then this last one is kind of associated with meat. It's like an MSG kind of flavoring. And that makes sense for us too. The fact that we can actually taste and enjoy meat is important because, as you remember from earlier in the year, protein and amino acids from protein are really important to building all the structures of your body. Kind of ran out of room with the formatting here, but what are the organs of taste and where are they located? So what we actually have is we have receptor hairs that are grouped in the taste bud. So the taste bud is really probably the organ, all right? And then those taste buds are in little papillas. So there's little bumps that have all these different taste buds in them. So you can kind of see that over here. This little bump, that's the papilla that we're zoomed in here. And then within that papilla, there are lots of little taste buds. Okay, so this is one little taste bud that we're zoomed in here. And within that taste bud, we have these structures. Okay, so you actually have the taste cell or gustatory cell. Sometimes it's listed that way. You got the little hairs sticking out. And then you've got the taste pore, is the little tiny microscopic opening where the dissolved molecules come in and bind on. Right, so you'll probably want to pause that and label that. And the next part of your packet talks about how is water tasted. And water is not really tasted. It's just detected. We have receptors in the back. It doesn't really have a flavor. Water doesn't really have a flavor. It has a sensation. It's a refreshing sensation. It's something that triggers us to want to drink a lot of water so we're not dehydrated. But it doesn't really have a taste. And you have receptors in the back that can recognize it. Okay? And then how does it all work? So very similar to smell. We have molecules dissolved. This time they're dissolved in saliva, not mucus in your nose. They got to bind to a receptor in the gustatory cell within the taste buds. You got those little cells inside there, the little taste hairs. Once threshold is reached, we send an impulse along the facial and glossopharyngeal nerves. This time we go to the brainstem, right? Up through the thalamus and into the gustatory cortex and the frontal lobe. So you'll want to pause that, I'm sure, and get those all filled in. All right, so that ought to take pretty good care of us, guys. The reason they're taught together, both taste and smells are taught together, is because they're both chemoreceptors. They both work very similarly. They have receptors for very specific chemicals. They've got to be dissolved before they can reach threshold and so forth. But that's what we're going to look at. And then the part we're going to stress tomorrow in the next couple of days is how linked they are. So there is a difference between flavor and taste. So taste is what comes from your taste buds. What these guys send information. This is going to be your taste information. Once you start adding in other things like the texture and the smell and things like that, that's what we really think of as the flavor of food. And we're going to do a whole bunch of activities and a couple of videos that show you that stuff as we go along. Hope that helps. Have a good night, guys.